Hello and welcome to our Tuesday chat, and I'm delighted to have Reverend Harold Good with us this morning. So Harold, it's great to see you.
And to see you, Stephen, brings back very, very happy memories of when we worked together when you were a student, and
yes,
I was supposed to be teaching you, but I learned a few things from you as well.
Well, that's very complimentary of you, Harold. I certainly learned things from you. Thank you. Well, we're delighted to have you here, Harold, and thank you for sharing with us. I mean, within this conversation, I guess we're going to reflect on different aspects of your life and the things that you've found yourself involved with. But I suppose maybe, first of all, maybe I'm particularly intrigued, what sort of influences you had from an early age, and something of your background and things that's sort of maybe motivated you early on in life.
Yes, well, I was born in the city of Derry, Londonderry, where my father was a minister. He was the superintendent of the Derry City Mission, and it was into that manse that I was born, and I spent the first 9 years of my life. And so I was nurtured within Methodism and within a manse. We moved to Belfast when I was 9 years of age. So that's where I did most of my growing up in the city of Belfast. But it was an interesting life. There was never a dull moment. Ours was a busy house with my two brothers, and nothing but the happiest memories of my childhood.
Brilliant, super, great. And I mean, in terms of your own training and education, how did that happen, and did you go straight in towards the ordained ministry?
Yeah, for some reason that I could never quite understand, people assumed that I was going to be the one who would follow my father's footsteps. It turned out actually that Peter, my brother, he also became a minister, but that was much later. He was what we call a mature candidate for the ministry. But I used to be puzzled as to why people thought I was the one who should be chosen, as it were. And but interestingly enough, we were at Methodist College, and in the year that I was in school, in my year and the year above and below, there were 9 of us altogether who went into ministries of one church or the other. Okay. And that would be unusual today. But it was something that we all felt very strongly we wanted to be a part of and to give our lives to. And so I didn't ever struggle against it, but I did make a very conscious decision. It wasn't just something I fell into or floated into. It was something that I felt strongly I wanted to be a minister, and I was influenced very much, I suppose, unconsciously more by growing up in a manse and observing ministry. It must have been a very positive experience that I observed. And but I also read some books about ministry. One in particular was the story of a minister called Mr. Lax, L-A-X, a very unusual name. Right. And he was a minister in the East End of London in Poplar. And I was absolutely fascinated. It was like reading an adventure story. And I remember thinking, gosh, if ministry is as much fun, because he saw the very happy side of ministry, and had as much meaning as that. Gosh, who would want to miss out on it? So that was sort of formation for me in my thinking about what I was going to do with my life.
Super. And do I pick up in what you referenced about this man in London, that it was sort of earthed in a socially challenged setting?
Absolutely. Yes.
and is that so? I'm thinking that caught your heart in some way that then found its expression later on in life. So.
Very much so. It was a very grounded ministry. There was nothing sort of abstract about his ministry. It was very real, and it was real people. They write stories about real people, and you know, and it just, I just saw it as something. Gosh, if that's what it's about, I think I could not only feel maybe I have something to bring to it, but I could actually enjoy it.
Yeah. Well, can I ask you about, so you found yourself going to the United States and what sort of setting you're in there, and you were there at a key time, and do you want to tell us anything about them?
I was ordained in 1962. And my first appointment after ordination was Waterford, not so very far from where you folks are. And after, you know, about 2 years there, I felt I wanted to explore the world a bit more. I felt, you know, I'd been grateful for the training I'd had, but I felt I needed more experience. And having grown up within the rather narrow confines of Irish Methodism and the island of Ireland, I felt, you know, I just felt the need to explore, to see what was over the hill, and to have wider experience, not only of ministry, but of life. And so that was where I had the opportunity to go to Ohio. And my wife, Clodagh, who I met in Waterford, we got married and literally set sail, because in those days we couldn't afford to fly. So we went by steamer to the United States. And that was 4 years of extraordinary experiences of one kind or the other. And it was exactly what I had hoped I might find.
Right. Fantastic. Wow. And what sort of church setting were you in there?
Well, I went to begin with, and it shows you how long ago it was that I was appointed to be minister to youth in a church, a very large church. There were 5 ministers on the staff, so you can imagine the contrast from a small congregation in Ireland to being a part of this very, very large church, and that was exciting. I enjoyed that. At the end of 2 years, we actually were due to come home after 2 years, but another door opened for me to go back to, as they say in America, to go back to school, back to seminary. And I had the opportunity to do a master's degree in pastoral care and counseling. And that was a very important, more important for me than I had realized at the time. And while I was there in the seminary studying, I was asked to look after an inner city church in Indianapolis. And it was a Black congregation. It needed pastoring for some months during an interim period. And I was asked if I would look after this church on a part-time basis. And that was, again, a hugely important experience, because it was during the middle of the 60s.
Right, yeah.
Civil rights struggle, the agony and the ecstasy of that period of time. I could not have realized how important this was going to be for me in preparing me for a ministry when I came back to Ireland.
Yeah. Well, and it was during that time that Martin Luther King was assassinated while you were there, is that right?
I wasn't very long looking into this interim ministry when Martin Luther King was assassinated. And I remember saying to the leaders of this church, you know, next Sunday, I'm sure there's somebody that you would like to take the service who can resonate and empathize with you in a way that I wouldn't be able to in the same way. I will sympathize deeply, deeply, deeply with you, but somebody who could empathize, somebody from within your own community. And they said to me, no, no, no. They said, you're our pastor. You pastor us through this. And I did. And they were extraordinary people. And I often say I learned more about the meaning of grace from those people during that period of time. It was an extraordinary privilege and a very moving one. And that I remember very particularly.
Wow, yeah, powerful. And well, you did eventually leave the United States, and maybe you speculated about coming to this area.
Yeah, after a period of time, we enjoyed the United States so much, and I got so much from it. After I graduated, I thought, my wife and I, Clodagh and I, both thought, we had 2 little girls born to us by this time, and we thought we really should share them with our family back home in Ireland, with our parents. These were the first grandchildren in the families. And so we thought we'd come home for 5 years. And I asked the conference if I could come back for 5 years. And I expressed an interest. I knew that the minister in Cloughjordan on your circuit, I knew the minister there was moving on, and I thought, gosh, that would be beautiful, a wonderful place. I'd been to a JMC there on one occasion, and I had a wonderful memory of the people there. And it would have been sort of close enough to Clodagh's home in Waterford, and I thought, and we were really very tired after those very, very busy years in the States. And I thought that would be just lovely. I didn't want to sit and do nothing, but I thought that would be anyhow, the word came back, and he said, no, you're not going to Cloughjordan. You're going to the Shankle Road in Belfast. Could there
very similar place.
Could there be anywhere less similar, And and again, I mean, really, the good Lord in his own way. I was being prepared for a ministry I could not have had otherwise, had I not had that time in the United States, preparing me unconsciously for a ministry in a very divided, hurting community. So we arrived back in Belfast with our 2 little ones, and in 1968, just when things were beginning to come to the surface, beginning of this dreadful period of what we call the Troubles. And I was there right at the heart of it.
Yeah. And do you want to say anything about your experience and during this time in the Shankle? And I mean, like you acknowledge, I'm conscious I was born in 1972, and I'm always aware that it was the worst year of the Troubles in a sense. So those years in particular, when I look at the statistics of the number of people that were killed, but it wasn't just, I see how the development, the increase in violence and people being killed within those years, I just think must have been so frightening. And yet, but on the ground, sorry, I used the word statistics, which is probably not right to use, because this is
I know what you mean.
The individual loss of people that you witnessed firsthand in those years. Do you want to reflect on that time?
Oh yeah, they were very dark days and nights. And I remember particularly, I think I remember the nights, because we within that community, the ministers and many of the good lay people as well, we used to walk the streets together at nights, because there were so very dark things happening and so many frightened people, and also people who were planning to do evil.
Yeah.
And young people who in their vulnerability were being caught up in it without realizing. And so we had young people who were going to prison. We had youngsters who were being drawn into paramilitary organizations. We had people being put out of their homes. And I remember particularly one Sunday morning, the word had gone around to Shankle Road. They, whoever they were, are coming over tonight to burn us out of our homes. And there was this fear at the heart of all of this. So much of it was just fear. Sometimes the fear was imaginary, sometimes the fear was very real. And this was one of the occasions when the fear was very real. It just gripped the community, and people were boarding up their windows of their homes on those little streets in the Shankle, believing that they were going to be attacked that night. And the men of the church said to me, "We're going home to get some hammers and nails. We're going to come down and board up the windows of the church."
Right.
And I said, "Well, you know what? I don't think we should. If people are frightened, they will need a place to which they feel they can come. Let's leave the lights on and the doors open." And we did. And you know what? Those lights never went out and the doors never closed for at least 3 weeks after that day. And the church became a refuge and became a place of safety and succor for people who, some of them who had been driven from their homes, and some of them who just were so frightened. There was one little family where mother couldn't cope with it all, and she took her own life, and we had to look after the children. Nowadays that wouldn't happen, but the social services could not cope with the problems. And so all of that was going on. And there wasn't much sleep during that time. And there were other occasions. I remember at a wedding, a bomb went off nearby. And as soon as I'd signed the book, I went down the street, and there was a building that had collapsed with a bomb, and we were with our bare hands digging through the rubble, and there were 2 little babies whose bodies were found, and 2 adults. It was that kind of, you never knew what was coming next.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. It's incredible. If you want to say anything else about that appointment on the Shankle Road,
I mean, there were wonderful people there. I do want to say that people had the impression that they were all dreadful people, and far from it. They were good people, and even a lot of those who got themselves drawn into trouble, so some of them in a reaction to what was happening. I can remember after that bombing that I talked about a moment ago, one young man, I met him years later, and he'd been in prison for many years. He told me it was that day that he was so angry with what had happened that he went and joined up one of the paramilitaries. And so you had people involved who you never would otherwise have been involved. And the other thing that we felt, gosh, we're doing all this kind of first aid stuff, but we really need to be talking about how do we, something more we can do about building relationships within this community. And I remember contacting Father Padraig Murphy, who was the priest over on the Falls Road. And I said to him, could we meet and talk? And he said, certainly. And I remember going over to his presbytery, and we said, we need to get our clergy together. We can't ask people to be reconciled if we're not being seen to be working and walking together. So that was the beginning of building a relationship between the clergy of the Shankle and the Falls. And then we brought lay people with us into that conversation, and we began to see how can we be bridge builders in that situation. And that was the beginning, for me, the beginning of learning how important it was to not just be working within our own silos, but to be reaching out across barriers and building some bridges. And if we as Christians could not do that, how could we ask it of others?
Mm-hmm. And I'm thinking in the 1970s in particular, I mean, and how, I mean, generally the wider public and maybe the churches in Northern Ireland, but maybe even your own churches, and I think you moved from the Shankle road to Ballynahinch and or whatever circuit you were in. How difficult was it to lead in terms of reconciliation when so many people were so affected by the losses around about them, and the tensions around justice and reconciliation? Do we want to reflect on that?
The interesting thing was that you know, and this was a huge challenge to us as ministers and priests, because we all worked in our own little corners. We'd grown up in a divided community, and we were all much more comfortable within our own grouping and our own setting. Then people sometimes were afraid that if we suggest we should do otherwise, that people would be critical of us. Remember, this was the time when Mr. Paisley was beginning to become into a very powerful force. And the message was, you don't talk to your enemy, and you don't talk, you know, you keep separate and all of that. And I discovered, you know what I discovered? That when you began to give some leadership in a different direction, people actually were saying that that's where they wanted to be in general. And I can remember for example, the weekend when Bombay Street, it was a very well-known and tragic situation where a whole street of Catholic families were burned out of their homes on Bombay Street. It was a dreadful time. And on the Sunday morning, I stood up in my church in Agnes Street on the Shankle Road, and I said, you know, I've been up to visit those families, and there's a great need for clothes, for baby things in particular. And if anybody has anything that they would like me to bring up, I'll be going up the next day or so. And if you bring that and leave it here at the church, I will take it in our name. And you know, going out of church that morning, older people were saying, we don't have anything to give, but look, maybe that would help. And they were giving me money. And I had a very sizable gift of money to bring up to those families, together with a huge carload of things that my congregation, the Protestant Shankle, wanted to bring up. And I found that for me was a huge lesson, that if you stand up and say, you know, there's a right thing to do. And wherever I was after that, in Ballynahinch, which was also a divided community, we became known as the Bridge Building Church. And our congregation grew. You know, we actually did lose some members. I can remember some people saying, we're not comfortable with your cross-community ministry, and they went elsewhere. But for everyone that left, there were 3 or 4 who came and joined us and said, we want to be part of a church that's reaching out and growing. And we desperately need leadership in our community and in our churches, people saying we're going to do the right thing because this is, we're compelled by the gospel to do what is right, and people will respond.
Powerful. That's powerful to hear you share that, Harold. Sorry, I'm conscious. I mean, you've mentioned your family, and I haven't specifically asked about your family, and then maybe other ministry in general. So I could easily skip on towards the 80s and maybe the early seeds of the peace process. But is there anything else about just either your general ministry or
well, yeah, I've had the great privilege of having a varied ministry. Part of it was as director of the Corrymela Centre for Reconciliation. And that again was a very important period of my ministry, to be able to share in a wider way with a wider community. And I've had all sorts of opportunities that have been very, very precious. And I think that the building of bridges has been a hugely important part of what I've learned and been privileged to be a part of. We all began talking to each other. I talked about, the clergy getting together. We realized after a while that was actually relatively easy. And then we began to talk to people who thought like we thought, and that was good. We needed to do that to encourage us and strengthen us. But, after a while, we were just talking to each other, and we were getting bored talking to each other about what should happen and what we might do. And it was then that we realized we needed to reach out to people that we had not talked to, and people who might be difficult to talk with. And that was the beginning of another dimension of ministry. Some of us from within our Methodist Council of Social Responsibility felt very strongly about this, and we reached out to people within the Republican community, and we had many, many long and late conversations. That led on to talking with some of the people who would be much more difficult to talk with. And yet we found that they too were looking for opportunities to talk. And so I remember thinking, if we can spin a thread, that thread might become a rope. Then that rope could become a bridge. And so our homes became places where people met who would otherwise never meet. And the open door and the kitchen table became very important. Because we could sit around the kitchen table just as people and talk with each other in a way that we couldn't in a very formal setting. It was good for people to get into formal settings, but the real work was done at the kitchen table. There's a whole story there of people who couldn't be seen to be talking, but we provided safe places where those conversations could take place, and they did eventually. Those threads became ropes. The ropes became bridges.
Well, that's very valuable for us to hear, because publicly we think about the peace process and the moves in the 90s that preceded in 98 the signing of the Belfast Agreement, but before then these things were happening, and these little quiet conversations, and so we just acknowledge all of that, and it's just good to be reminded that this is the crucial work of peace, that doesn't all hit the headlines. It's those one-to-one cups of tea and sharing together. So and so we just acknowledge your crucial role in all of that, how just stepping out and doing the things that you could do. So
just to say about it wasn't just, one thing led to another, the whole story of different things I became involved in. One of the aspects of my life was when I first met Father Alec Reid, a good Tipperary man.
Was he from Tipperary?
Yes, Father Alec Reid was from Tipperary.
Right.
Yeah, and for the GAA folks who may be listening, he was in his youth. He was quite a star. I think he had to choose between priesthood and a career as a player, and but he was always a very proud man from Tip. And Alec and I became involved in the primarily in the decommissioning process, which is a whole story in itself. We could do a whole program on that, but that was an enormous privilege to be trusted, by people, to be a part of that. So that's where Alec and I began to work together. And then he had been working quietly in the Basque country, trying to encourage the Basque separatists, ETA, to make peace.
Yeah.
And I was drawn into that story as well. And it was an extraordinarily privileged day when, together with the Archbishop of Bologna, who was also involved in that story, we were part of the decommissioning of the weapons and the weaponry of ETA. So what was happening here was part of something happening elsewhere. And also I was invited to go to Colombia to talk with the FARC folks about decommissioning their weapons. And so what was happening in Ireland was it wasn't in isolation from what was happening around the world. And if we have something to offer, we need to remember that we're part of a sad story around our world where we do need to, and one of the sadnesses for me is that having made our peace process, our agreement, we haven't fully implemented it, and we're still, but I still believe and hope that we will continue on this journey and complete it.
Yeah. It totally, and I think, the present times are exposing how fragile, the peace is, but ultimately the old divisions are there, and even as you acknowledge, like certainly it's been in the news of one loyalist leader talking, saying that the Good Friday Agreement doesn't apply anymore, or whatever he was saying. So do you think we have become more complacent in recent years about the peace that is on the streets, or the political?
Yeah, I think this is where everything becomes interrelated, and there's unrest across the world, and there's unrest within these islands. Brexit has had a very, very negative, detrimental impact upon our peace process. People who have used that in a negative way, but it has also put division within Europe, between these islands, east, west, north, south, and all of that. So we're living very uncertain times, and I think we have reason to be anxious. But having said all that, I think that there's a conversation emerging, and people will say, "Oh, you're being too political here." I make no apology for the fact that saying we are going to have a serious conversation about the future of this island. We can't go on living with our head in the sand, pretending that it's going to be as it is forever and ever. And this is not, I'm not taking a political position when I say, this year of the centenary of the state of Northern Ireland and partition and all of that. As we look back, there must have been a better way. There must have been a better way than dividing this island as it has been divided. And maybe, and I believe it is the time for an opportunity for a much more serious, open, honest conversation between us all across this island.
Yeah.
How can we make this island a better place? What do we have to bring to each other across this island? As Protestants and Catholics, nationalists and unionists, we have something precious to bring. And do you know what?
Yeah.
We could be a beacon of light to the world.
Yeah.
And that's my next focus, is to try. And already those conversations are taking place.
Yeah.
We had it here in my home not very long ago between people who otherwise would never have met in the same room. And we're talking not about United Ireland in this form or that form or the other shape. We're saying, let's talk about the future of this island.
Yeah.
How can we come together in some new way, And I think the negative things that are happening across Europe, the protocols and all of those things are driving us to a new conversation. Let's grasp this new conversation and be honest with each other. Not how do we take over each other, or how do we absorb the other into our way of thinking, but how, it's a wonderful island if we could only realize it. And we have so much to offer each other across this island. And I'm passionate about this conversation.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's coming across, Harold. And, I just find it's so inspiring to hear you speak with that passion. At your stage of life, let's, you're
I'm over 21.
I know you're still a young man, but I think we all need to hear this, because we can think to ourselves, oh, well, if sometimes I think to myself, well, if I was a Methodist minister in that setting 30 or 40 years ago, I'd have been in there and whatever, but this is now, and we all live in the present, and we've all got to step back and look at what our calling is, ministers or not, and be a part of addressing the needs and the challenges in our own time, the different areas where reconciliation is needed. And so it's exciting to hear, you speak of conversations you're having in the present that connect with the present time. So, and I just find this very inspiring, Harold. And if there's anything else you want to share, I suppose, as we do come towards the close on this front, or anything at all.
Well, I think COVID has again been another challenge to us all. We didn't need this.
Yeah.
Of course we didn't. And we grieve for those who have lost their lives and their loved ones through COVID. And we keep saying, well, maybe we could learn something out of this. Maybe, maybe it'll help us to keep some things more in proportion and perspective. But I think it's going to be a huge challenge for us. The churches will not be the same again after, particularly in these urban situations where we are, maybe in the rural communities, and where you are, it may be different people will gather themselves together again very quickly. But it's going to be very different here, and there's a new generation coming along. And how do we connect with that new generation? How do we excite young people about their role in this world? How do we, because there's another generation that is sort of saying, we're not interested in all of that. We just want to get on with our own lives. And, and I think we do need to bring our young people. I have now 2 great-grandchildren,
Really? Okay.
and I think of my children, my grandchildren, and my great-grandchildren. What kind of a world are we leaving them? And I want just to think not just about what kind of a world are we leaving them, but how can they become a part of helping to shape the future. The whole thing about climate change has shown us that if we can excite young people and challenge them, they then in turn will challenge us, and they will give the leadership.
Yeah.
And in terms of making peace, I think we really have to try and ask our young people to help us, because it's their world. We're handing it on to them.
Yeah.
It's our island home, and that's the challenge. We'll soon be leaving this mortal coil, as we talk about, and what are we leaving to others? But I want to ask them to learn from our mistakes and to have a vision for what they want, not just for themselves, but for their children. And if we could think like that and leave the old ways behind and find new ways, and that, I believe, is what God is asking us to do. And that's why I do not divorce what I do and what I say from my ministry. I see it as an integral part of it. If that's not what the gospel is about, then I have misunderstood it.
Yes. Amen. Totally. Well, thank you, Harold. And I think that's it.
Bless you in your ministry and wherever it takes you, Stephen.
Well, thank you very much. Well, thank you for your time with us. We really appreciate this time.
Yeah. Next time you're up this way, give me a call and we'll have a coffee.
Will do.
Please do.
Right.
All right. God
Thank you.
bless. And greetings.